When water is plentiful, you can get away with growing crops that demand regular irrigation. But when water gets tight, the question changes. It's no longer, can I keep this plant alive? It becomes, if I spend some of my limited water here, am I still going to get food back? Because a plant surviving a dry spell and a plant producing a useful harvest through one are two very different things, and none of the crops on this list can produce without water. They still need moisture, especially during establishment and at critical stages of growth. The advantage is relative. These are crops that give you better options when abundant, perfectly timed water is no longer something you can count on. And the farther we go down this list, the more that difference matters. 7. Sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are a good place to start because they expose one of the biggest mistakes people make when thinking about a survival garden. They focus on what grows. You need to focus on what you can actually eat. A bed full of leafy plants may look productive, but in a food shortage, calories matter. Sweet potatoes put those calories underground in roots that can also be stored after harvest. And once established, sweet potatoes are relatively drought tolerant. That doesn't mean you plant slips into bone dry soil and forget about them. Establishment matters. Water availability still affects growth and yield. But compared with a garden built entirely around thirsty vegetables, sweet potatoes give you something much more useful, a crop that combines drought tolerance with substantial food production. The vines also cover the soil as they spread, which can help shade the soil surface. So, this first crop establishes our real standard. We aren't looking for plants that simply refuse to die. We're looking for plants that can justify the water they receive. And the next crop does that in a completely different way. 6. Okra. If you've ever seen a garden struggling through a brutal stretch of summer, okra can look almost out of place. It likes heat. It tolerates relatively dry conditions. And instead of waiting all season for one harvest, a healthy plant can keep producing pods that are picked repeatedly. That's valuable in a survival garden because production isn't only about total pounds at the end of the year, it's also about continuity. A crop that gives you something edible every few days fills a different role from a storage crop sitting underground. But there's an important limit here. Okra will produce better with adequate water. Dry tolerance doesn't mean water stops affecting yield. That's a distinction we're going to keep making because it's the difference between realistic preparedness and internet mythology. Okra earns its place because it can handle conditions that punish many conventional garden vegetables while still producing food. But pods alone aren't enough. If the situation lasts, you start caring about protein and food that can be dried and stored. That's where the next crop becomes much more interesting. 5. Cowpeas. Black-eyed peas are one familiar form of cowpea, but the crop is bigger than that one variety. Cowpeas are well adapted to hot conditions and are notably tolerant of drought once established. More importantly, they produce something extremely useful in a preparedness context, beans that can be dried and stored. Now, the garden isn't only giving you food for tonight, it's producing food you can carry forward. Cowpeas also handle summer heat well, including conditions in which some other beans can struggle to set seed. And that changes the calculation. When water is limited, every crop is competing for the same resource. Giving that water to something that can produce a storable, protein-rich seed starts to look very different from spending it on a crop that demands frequent irrigation for a highly perishable harvest. Again, establishment still matters. Drought tolerance doesn't eliminate the need for moisture, but cowpeas introduce another principle into this list. A survival crop becomes more valuable when the harvest solves more than one problem, and our next crop takes that idea even further. 4. Amaranth is interesting because depending on the type you grow, You're not necessarily planting it for just one harvest. The leaves of edible varieties can be used as greens. Other types are grown for seed, and amaranth is grown in dry climates around the world and can tolerate drought once established. That gives it a different role from sweet potatoes. Okra or cowpeas. You can think of a resilient food system as a portfolio. One crop gives you roots, another gives you pods, another gives you dry beans. Amaranth can add greens, and with appropriate grain varieties, seed. That diversity matters because drought doesn't affect every crop in exactly the same way, at exactly the same moment. A garden built around one perfect drought tolerant crop can still fail. A garden built around crops with different growth patterns and different edible parts spreads that risk. But now we're going to cross a line. The first four crops are relatively easy to understand as familiar garden choices with useful drought tolerance. The next three push deeper into crops specifically associated with hot, dry production, and the first one is a bean that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. 3. Tepary beans. The tepary bean comes from a very different agricultural story than the typical garden bean. It is native to the arid southwest of North America and has a long history as a crop among indigenous peoples of the Sonoran Desert region. And its reputation isn't just historical. Tepary beans are recognized for both heat and drought tolerance, which is why researchers have studied them as a possible crop for hot, dry production systems and as genetic material for improving other beans. Think about what that means for our original problem. If water is becoming the limiting resource, one response is to keep growing conventional crops and fight harder to maintain the conditions they prefer. Another response is to ask whether you're growing the right species in the first place. Tepary beans make that second question impossible to ignore. They still need suitable growing conditions. Individual varieties differ, and being adapted to drought doesn't make them invulnerable to every kind of stress, but they represent something bigger than one bean. Sometimes resilience comes from improving how you water. Sometimes it comes from changing what you're watering. And once you apply that principle to staple grains, the difference gets even larger. 2. Sorghum. For a lot of people, a survival grain means corn, and that's exactly why sorghum matters. Corn can be enormously productive under the right conditions, but when rainfall becomes too low or unreliable, agricultural guidance in dry regions specifically identifies sorghum as an alternative because of its drought adaptation. That is a much stronger argument than simply saying, this plant handles heat. We're now talking about replacing one staple strategy with another when the water equation changes. Grain sorghum can produce dry grain that stores well and can become part of a serious calorie strategy, and that changes the scale of the garden. Okra can help keep food coming onto the table. Cowpeas can give you dry legumes. Sweet potatoes can give you roots. Sorghum begins to address the grain side of the equation. Of course, this comes with trade-offs. Growing, harvesting, and processing grain at home is a different commitment from picking tomatoes or digging potatoes. Birds, pests, variety selection, and local growing conditions can all matter. But that's exactly the point. There is no magic crop. There are only crops whose strengths match your constraints better than others. And if the constraint we're optimizing for is hot, dry conditions, there's one cereal that pushes that idea even further. 1. Pearl millet. Pearl millet is the crop that makes the title of this video clearest. It isn't valuable because it somehow grows without water. It doesn't. It's valuable because it is exceptionally well adapted to hot, dry environments and can produce under conditions where many other cereal crops become much less dependable. Pearl millet has been grown as a food crop in some of the world's harsh dryland environments. It can grow on relatively poor soils, and its drought adaptation is one reason it remains important in regions where rainfall can be limited and unreliable. So imagine the original problem again. Your available water is falling. You can respond by trying to preserve a garden designed for abundant water, or you can redesign the garden around the resource you actually have. Pearl millet represents the far end of that second strategy, not keeping an unsuitable crop alive at any cost. Choosing a crop whose biology already gives you a better starting point, and that's the larger lesson behind all seven. If water becomes scarce, don't build your entire food plan around the mythical plant that doesn't need water. It doesn't exist. Build around different kinds of production. Sweet potatoes for calorie dense roots, okra for repeated harvests through summer heat, cowpeas for a drought tolerant legume and storable beans, amaranth for another layer of edible diversity, tepary beans for a legume deeply adapted to hot, dry conditions, sorghum for a drought adapted grain option, and pearl millet for some of the toughest hot dry cereal growing conditions on the list. Then protect the water advantage you've gained. Keep soil covered where appropriate. Reduce unnecessary competition from weeds. Establish crops properly. Choose varieties suited to your climate. And concentrate limited irrigation where it can protect the harvest at the stages that matter most. Because when water gets tight, the winning strategy isn't seeing how long you can force a thirsty garden to survive. It's making every gallon support a food system designed for the conditions you're actually facing.